And so also, if anyone has any questions that might pop up throughout the presentation, feel free to put them in the chat, so then we'll try to address them at the end of the talk. But yeah, go ahead, Dr. Reed.
Great. Thank you all so much for having me. I'm going to screen share here. Everybody can see that all right? Awesome. Good afternoon, everyone. Ayukwi. My name is Kaitlin. I'm faculty in the Native American Studies Department at Cal Poly Humboldt. I'm also the co-director of the Rudalagur Food Sovereignty Lab and Traditional Ecological Knowledges Institute. We opened on Friday, but then, of course, our campus is closed, if you've been reading the news. But feel free to kind of follow along on the important work that the Food Sovereignty Lab is doing. Folks can check that out online. I am calling in from Wiyot territory today. I live along Badawat or Mad River. I'm a member of the Yurok tribe. We're just north of Wiyot territory, and I'm also a Hoopa and Oneida person. I will be talking about my book today. It came out almost a year ago now. It came out in June of 2023 from the University of Washington Press. And despite the fact that I'm now often like pigeonholed as like the weed girl, it was never really my intention to like write a book about cannabis. My intention had always been to write a text about settler. Okay. Sorry. I sorry if I muted myself. I didn't realize. Um, uh, um, and so the intention of the book, right, was to write a text about settler colonialism, specifically the ecology of settler colonialism. And cannabis just happened to be the thing that my tribal government was really battling against when I started graduate school almost a decade ago now. And so it's kind of more so a byproduct, right? The text happens to center around cannabis. Really, my goal is to kind of trace the historical and ecological dots from the gold rush to the green rush, which in my mind was always the title of the book. But when you go and write a book, one of the things that happens is the press is probably going to rename it. So the book is now titled, oh, sorry, my mouse is dead, so I have to unplug it every time I want to use it. Okay. The book is titled Settler Cannabis From Gold Rush to Green Rush in Indigenous Northern California. On the right here, you can see the table of contents. I won't kind of go through every single chapter with us today, but the first half of the text is primarily historical, right? I make the argument that contemporary ecological devastation as a result of illegal trespass cultivation, right, doesn't exist in a vacuum, right? It is a product of patterns of settler colonial resource extraction that we've witnessed since the invasion of California. And the second half of the book then hones in on some of the ramifications of the green rush. And I've organized these somewhat arbitrarily because they are fundamentally intertwined, but I organize it around land dispossession, water, and toxics. And so for our talk today, I thought I would spend a little bit of time talking about this theoretical framework I employ in the book, Settler Colonialism. I thought I'd kind of walk us through a bit of California Indian history. I know you all had Dr. Risling Baldy last week, so I maybe give an abbreviated version of that. And then to conclude the talk, we can look at some photographs of illegal trespass grows cited in Northwestern California. And the photos that we'll look at are primarily within Yurok ancestral territory and date from about 2015 to about 2017. I'll just leave my mouse on. So the first thing I want to say about settler colonialism is the ways in which it is distinct from other forms of colonialism. Right? I teach a lot of intro level classes, and like my students are familiar, right, with like external or extractive colonialism, where small amount of colonists show up in a place, take things that don't belong to them, right, and go home and generate wealth. Settler colonialism is a bit unique because that wealth extraction happens, right, to be sure. But in addition to extracting bodies, plants, animals, resources, right, you're also needing to then craft a new narrative, right, that justifies that that place is your home, right, and it belonged to you, right? And so settlers have to turn indigenous lands into both their new home as well as a source of capital, right? And so this is where we get ideologies like manifest destiny, right? Where God somehow told settlers it was theirs, right? I always ask my students, like, what evidence we have of that? Like, did God text settlers and be like, hey, this is yours, right? No, of course, it's made up. It becomes a legal fiction, right? To borrow the language of Walter Echohawk. Um, and then simultaneously a source of capital. To do that, something really violent has to happen, right? We can think about the removal or displacement of native peoples, but also land as a living, breathing entity with its own agency, right? Land as relative, as teacher, as family member, as ancestor, right? That has to be violently transformed into an object, something that is dead, right? Private property, real estate, right? And so that relationships between human people and land are then relegated to a relationship of owner to property or owner to real estate. And anything, any type of relationship with land that falls outside of that, right, is then demarcated as primitive, savage, backward, etc. Simultaneously, and I'm drawing on the work of Tuck and Yang here, that the disruption of indigenous relationships to land represents a profound violence. This violence is not only asserted with the arrival of the settler, but is reasserted every day of occupation, right? So the example I give, every morning I wake up and Green Diamond Natural Resource Company owns 60% of my ancestral territory, right? That's colonial occupation being reasserted. I'll also make the same argument for Redwood National Park, right? And even when we were talking about kind of enclosures in the name of conservation, right? Green colonialism, right? Those same sort of violences are reasserted. So here I am drawing on the work of Patrick Wolfe, a late Australian anthropologist who wrote a famous piece titled Settler Colonialism and the Elimination of the Native. He makes two key arguments that I will flag here. One, settler colonialism is a structure, not an event, right? It didn't happen in 1492 and it's over now, complete, done, right? It is ongoing. And the kind of ultimate privilege of being a settler in a settler state, right, is that it becomes so normalized, it's invisibilized, right? And so we often don't think about settler colonialism being continually reenacted or reasserted, right? Because that is a privilege, right, of settlers within a settler state. Uh, Secondly, Wolfe argues that elimination, right, is the ultimate goal of settler colonialism to gain access to land, and that elimination happens in a lot of different ways, right? I'm sure Kutcha filled you in on the volunteer militias, right, that are ravaging the state of California from 1850 into the mid 1870s. And often when we think about the elimination of Native peoples, we think of these kind of spectacular acts of violence, right? Something like really horrific. Here, I want to draw our attention to the chart at the bottom of the screen to help us think about how actually elimination is much more common and insidious than we might think, right? We can think about physical elimination via genocide, via the volunteer militias in California, via the forced sterilizations by Indian Health Services as late as the 1970s, and then again by ICE at the US-Mexico border less than a decade ago. We can think about cultural elimination, right? Through boarding schools. Indian offenses refers to the criminalization of Native American religions. Unfun fact, Native American religions do not become legal until 1978. Our religious freedoms are less than 50 years old in a nation theoretically founded on religious freedoms. Political elimination occurs through the ignoring of treaty rights, terminating political status, which the US federal government does to over 100 tribal nations in the 1950s. And then perhaps most predominantly, right, discursive elimination, right? This refers to the erasure of Native peoples altogether. It's when they're not on the board, they're not in the room, they're not invited to the meeting. If they are talked about, there's some tangential side box, right, placed off into the margins of our textbook, right? They're never really kind of center, right, to the conversation. And so this refers to the lack of representation or native peoples, but also like inaccurate misrepresentation, right, as well. And so, as a scholar who is primarily interested in Indigenous environmental justice, I am really interested in the ways in which settler colonialism is fundamentally an ecological phenomenon, right? So, the metaphor I give to my students, and I'm at Humboldt, so everybody raises their hand, but I ask them, who's grown a garden before? Right? And then I will ask them to imagine that they are forced at gunpoint to march 100 miles west of their garden. And there they are detained for a year, 5 years, a century, right? What does your garden look like when you get home? It's probably not a garden there anymore. Right. And so if we operate under the assumption, right, that native peoples are not these primitive hunter gatherers wandering around and grabbing a berry here and a berry there, but instead had developed complex ecological management regimes developed over millennia, when we murder or remove native peoples, that is going to have large ramifications, right, on the ecology of our place. And when I was writing this book, I was really just gobsmacked about how much US environmental history doesn't think about settler colonialism at all. Right, because many environmental discourse, right, deploys the language of like the pristine, untouched virgin wilderness, right, very prevalent in like national park discourse, conservation, preservation movements, right? And if we don't actually have a grasp, right, of how settler colonialism has impacted the ecology of our places, we really don't have any sort of understanding of the environmental history of our places at all, right? And so I'm often confronted to this question: why don't we just turn back the ecological clock? And my response is always, to what? When it was untouched virgin wilderness? Because that's never existed in this place, right? California Indians have always been actively managing their ecosystems, right, with bodies of scientific knowledge developed over generations. And so here I'm pulling a chart from G.M. Bacon. He's an environmental sociologist in Oregon, and he's thinking about these forms of elimination as cited by Wolf, right, through an eco-social lens. And so we can think about the ongoing elimination of native peoples, right, through these venues, right? So we can think about physical elimination through the theft of water, the poisoning of water, right? Building dams so that your river gets so hot and all your fish suffocate, right? And you have the largest fish kill in American history. That happened on the Klamath River in 2002. Right? We see cultural elimination through the disruption of ecological knowledge, right? I would also add the criminalization of ecological knowledge. We'll talk about fire very briefly in today's talk, but Ron Reed is a Karuk cultural practitioner, and he always says, to be a good Karuk Indian, you have to be a criminal. What he means is, due to over a century and a half of fire suppression policies in the state of California, right, if Karuk peoples wanted to maintain and care for their forest in the ways that they've done since the beginning of time, right, you got to risk going to jail for arson, right? Because when the U.S. Forest Service is established, what they don't want, right, is a forest that meets all of your needs. What they do want is to maximize timber production, right? And fire regimes aren't conducive to that, right? We can see political elimination again through land loss, privatizing lands so native peoples can't access them, and then of course ignoring treaty rights. And then we see discursive elimination, right, by renaming or repurposing, right, all of these places that have been integral to California Indian peoples and Indigenous peoples across the Americas. And so to kind of end this introductory portion of the talk, when we think about California Indian people's relationships to their lands, we must remember, right, that this settler colonial ideology that tries to impose ideas like New World, manifest destiny, untouched wilderness, right, all of that is made up, right, fictitious. And the New World is in fact a very, very old world. All right, let's talk about weed. I have a couple caveats. I know this is a divisive relative for some communities. And so there's a couple things I like to say about this plant relative before we begin. One, cannabis is a plant. That means it's a relative, and we have to treat it with respect, just like we do all of our more than human relatives. And this plant didn't actually do anything wrong. It's people. It is human beings, right? The youngest of creation, the ones known for always messing up. Second, I really don't care if you smoke weed. You don't need to disclose that to me after the talk. I really, really don't care. To me, cannabis is almonds, right? We grow a lot of almonds in Central California. It uses a ton of water. They are primarily exported outside of California, outside of the United States, where a select few corporations make gratuitous profit, right, off of almond production in the state of California.
Mm.
A lot of us might have consumed almonds. Maybe we think they're a tasty snack. Maybe we're lactose intolerant. Maybe we're just trying to consume less dairy. For whatever reason, right? Many of us may have had almonds or almond milk. There's not sort of this moral debate or moral quandary over like whether we should be eating or consuming almonds. To me, kind of debates around whether we should be growing weed or whether we should be consuming weed actually detract from what I'm interested in that this is a huge agricultural commodity that is continuing to be grown unregulated in many parts of the state, and it's having massive ecological ramifications, right? The morality of this plant relative to me is just not interesting, and I don't really care. So my metaphor is that cannabis is almonds, right? I'm more interested in kind of thinking about the specific geographical regions and the quantities, right, that this crop is produced and what the ramifications are of that, right? California has some of the highest rates of production in the nation. I refer to my neck of the woods, Yurok ancestral territory, as the ground zero for illicit cannabis production. We are the first state to legalize medicinal cannabis in the 1990s. We're also the first state to outlaw cannabis in the early 20th century. And it was primarily a means to harass, prosecute, and criminalize Latinx migrant communities, many of which are actually indigenous folk from Mexico, Central America, and South America who have migrated right into California. The state did the exact same thing a century prior when they banned opium as a way to harass and prosecute Chinese migrants at the time. And so I'm not going to say a ton about drug prohibition during this talk. What I will say is that it's never been about what cannabis does. It's always been about who does cannabis, right? Like all right racial projects, drug prohibition is not unique, right, and is primarily designed right to harass, prosecute, and criminalize people of color in some sort of moral right justification, as in the war on drugs, right? What this does mean for our region in Northwestern California, though, is that a lot of contemporary production practices are kind of left over from the drug war days, right? When you have camp helicopters kind of circling over, right? And so this means often what we will see is growers don't want to put all of their eggs in one basket, right? If the DEA is going to find you, you don't want that to be your whole harvest, right? And so one example of kind of leftover drug war ideology is that you have several smaller grows kind of sprawled out, right, rather than one central grow where all of your crops are. And so I'm just going to provide that one example, but in this one example we can see that the ecological impacts of cannabis cultivation here isn't constrained right within a particular area, but due to the kind of concern, right? Oh, what if camp comes this year, right? You spread them out. And so we're seeing the ecological impacts of that, right? Also spread out. And so that's just kind of one example I'll give. As mentioned at the top, it was never my plan to write a book about cannabis, but looking retrospectively, I think I first started thinking about cannabis as a young scholar my freshman year of college. I went to a small private liberal arts school in the Hudson Valley in New York State. And on the first day, my dorm floor gathered into a circle and we went around and said our names, where we were from, etc. And I said, hey, I'm Kaitlin. I'm originally from Humboldt County. I'm a Yurok tribal member. They tuned out after that. They heard Humboldt County and their eyes lit up. Right. The assumption being that I was going to be able to provide them, right, affordable cannabis from a reputable region. Right. And as a young geography major at the time, I thought, how did this commodity, right, travel from my ancestral territory 3,000 miles east, right, to the eastern seaboard where it is selling, and I'm not even joking, $65 for an eighth of an ounce, right? It went on the back burner in my mind for a couple of years. And then in 2014, I somehow got a job with my tribe's environmental program, the Yurok Tribe Environmental Program. It is now YTED, Yurok Tribe Environmental Department. And I was sitting at my desk in July and, procrastinating. I was probably like scrolling social media, whatever. And we got a notification from the tribe, and it was sent to all employees that Operation Yurok was taking place. Operation Yurok, if folks are unfamiliar, was a tribally spearheaded cannabis eradication campaign where the Yurok tribe actually used drought emergency relief funding from the governor's office to kind of piecemeal together this multi-jurisdictional team, right? That included the Yurok tribe, local, county, state, and federal law enforcement, right, and other entities. Like the DEA was there, the National Guard was there, like the BIA was there, the FBI was there. And not to get into an entire lecture on federal Indian law and policy, but our reservation is a small fraction of our ancestral territory, right? Our reservation extends from the mouth of the Klamath River, 44 miles up, and then a mile on each riverbank, right? And so kind of a tiny fraction of ancestral territory. And so what that means for trespass grows is that if it's not within that narrow strip, the tribe doesn't have jurisdiction. And so one example is there was a cultivation site located just on the opposite side of the reservation boundary, right? They had a pipe that crossed the reservation boundary where they were siphoning water from a tributary within the reservation. All the tribe had the jurisdiction to do was saw the pipe in half, right? They couldn't actually issue a warrant for the trespass grow because it was outside of tribal jurisdiction. And so that was kind of one of the points of Operation Yurok. But I remember being in my office and I saw like people in camo with like assault rifles slung around their shoulder and like military tanks. And as like a young person about to like start graduate school, right, I was thinking about when the last time, right, such a militarized presence was felt within our reservation, right? I thought about the fish wars of the 1970s where fish and game wardens are holding Yurok fishermen's heads underwater and hauling them off to jail, sexually assaulting Yurok women, right? But what I was really thinking about a lot was the California gold rush, right? Because this discourse around cannabis really kind of front and center around kind of 2014 into 2016 had all of these references, right, to the green rush. And I was really kind of being like, well, what's the assumption embedded behind that, right? That this gold rush is this amazing thing where everybody is going to get rich, right? And we saw people from all over the state, from all over the nation, and from all over the world, right, applying for cannabis cultivation permits in Humboldt County when Humboldt passed its cannabis land use ordinance in 2016, right? And so all of these references to the gold rush, and that was not lost on a California Indian person. And I'm like, well, what was the gold rush to us? The gold rush was an apocalypse. The gold rush was a genocidal violence. The gold rush was environmental destruction, right? And yet in California, we continue to memorialize and celebrate, right, the gold rush across all parts of public school education, within tourism, right? And even as like an adult, we can't shake it right? If you whip out your ID right now, you're going to see a gold miner right next to your head. And every time I get ID'd, right, I'm confronted with gold rush imagery with little to no recognition, right, of the genocidal violence that that entailed, right? And so I'll abbreviate here because Katja gave you the rundown last week, but we see the creation of militias that are killing Native peoples to receive bounties, right, on their body parts. And we see massive environmental destruction, right, occur during this time. Right. And so I'm going to share some of these here so that we can begin to draw parallels as I go through the remainder of the resource rushes that we see in California. We see the clear cutting of forests. We see the pollution and diversion of waterways. We see the changing and composition of grasslands and woodlands, right? Because they don't want to, they see acorns and they're like, primitive foods, right? We want beef, right? We want hogs, we want sheep, right? And for California Indian peoples who had a very adept knowledge of plants, right? We would rely on a lot of roots or tubers, right? Which are incredibly plentiful when managed appropriately, right? But when you got hooved critters, right, walking around in riparian ecosystems, that is really detrimental, right, for a lot of California Indian food sources. We see the prohibition of burning. This will become even more significant when we talk about the timber rush, but pretty much immediately in the state of California, we see efforts at criminalizing the traditional ecological knowledge of Native peoples. This actually begins before the gold rush. And so the mission system, right, established in the mid 1700s, we immediately see soldiers writing in their diaries, WTF, why are all these Indians lighting everything on fire? Right? They didn't understand the complexity of our land management practices, right? And then sought to eliminate and control, right, what they did not understand. We see fire suppression then enacted by the state of California in the same year of the state's founding. There's a law called the Act for the Governance and Protection of Indians. It's a bit of a misnomer because it does neither of those things. It is a law that facilitates the slavery of Indigenous children, despite the fact that California enters the Union as a free state, right? It legalizes the corporal punishment of California Indian peoples and then provides legal immunity to white settlers for crimes committed against Native peoples. And they sneak in a one sentence clause to suppress fire. It's section 10. It's one sentence long. It's teeny tiny. And for me, that really cements, right, this relationship between the violence enacted against Indigenous peoples, right, and the control over ecological management systems. And then the argument of the text is that this resource rushing, right, is a pattern. Not everybody got rich with gold. You have to continually rush additional things, right? And so as we move from the gold rush into the timber rush into the fish rush, my joke about the green rush is that we already know how this story ends, right? I finished writing the book like a few years right before it was published, but flash forward to today, you have all these pot farms in Humboldt County going belly up, right? Called it. That's what resource rushing means. And then kind of the secondary argument is that this relationship between violence against Indigenous lands and bodies is then paralleled, right, in violence against the landscape. I'll say a few words about the kind of the other rushes, and then we'll get into some photographs of trespass cannabis cultivation. Throughout the timber rush, right, we see a loss of 96% of old growth redwood, right, in northwestern California. The U.S. Forest Service is established in 1910, right, and their kind of worldview, right, is forests, the value of a forest is its monetary value, right? Meaning how much board feet of timber, right, can you get out of this forest? And so we see additional kind of layering of fire suppression policies. By the 1940s, we get this guy, who I'm sure folks are familiar with. We can kind of dissect some of the language here, right? Fire is wasteful. Fire weakens you. Fire is madness, right? It's like actually crazy, right? And all of these fire dependent ecosystems across California, right, have been deprived of this crucial medicine, right, to keep our forests healthy. And now California sees catastrophic wildfires every single season, right? Again, another example where if we had just listened to Indigenous peoples, things wouldn't be so bad, right? Chapter 3 then hones in on the fish rush. Here, I think about the impacts of settler colonialism on our more than human relatives, primarily salmon. This chapter goes through the fish kill that happened in 2002 along the Klamath River, but also here's another example. I am trying to draw parallels between violence enacted against the landscape, right? Our river, making our river sick, killing off our fish populations, and then the health of indigenous bodies, right? And so, in large part, right, we see disproportionate health impacts in Native American communities due to settler colonial violence. And so I've pulled this chart, or these two charts, excuse me, from Kari Norgard's book, Salmon and Acorns Feed Our People. The top graph shows us what percentage of Karuk families when they saw diabetes appear in their family. And so almost 30%, right, of Karuk families see diabetes appear in the 1970s. A little over 15% see diabetes appear in the 1980s. And then over 10% see diabetes appear either in the 1960s or the 1990s. If we look at the bottom graph, the dark colored line is the percentage of families that have diabetes, right? So we see this steadily increasing between 1950 and 2000, right? The light gray line, the one that is declining, this is the percentage of families that are able to harvest spring Chinook salmon as a significant food source. We see this steadily decline, right, between 1950 and 2000, and the two lines intersect in the early 1970s. It's Zoom, so I'll give it away. But I always ask the audience, like, what happened in the 1960s, right? The Klamath dams were built and they cut off passage to salmon to Karuk territory. Karuk is actually a Yurok word for upriver, right? And so salmon are not able to pass the dams to get into Karuk territory. And so we see a subsequent decline in the families able to eat spring Chinook salmon and a subsequent increase, right, in the families that experience diabetes, right? And so this is another way, right, that settler colonialism is ongoing, right? We continue to see the ramifications of settler colonial violence in the everyday lived experiences of Native communities with disproportionate health impacts. The first half of the book kind of closes with the origins of cannabis cultivation in Northwestern California. This chapter title is borrowed from an ENC graduate alum, Laura Hurwitz. The chapter is called Back to Whose Land? Right? This is a snarky riff, right, on the Back to the Land movement. If you're unfamiliar, the Back to the Land movement describes groups of primarily white, middle, upper class folks from places like the San Francisco Bay area, Sacramento area, right, who are flocking into Northwestern California to, quote, live off the land. Right. The reason they're able to afford land is because the timber industry had just collapsed. Right. And so all of these places had been clear cut and their kind of monetary value plummets. Because again, that's what happens when you resource rush. Right. And so they're able to afford property. They come to Northwestern California and they very quickly realize they have no idea how to live off the land. Right. And so they quickly begin cultivating cannabis to sell for cash income, to pay for food, to pay for fuel, right, for heat, right, whether that's wood or propane, whatever, gasoline, right, they're buying, and property taxes, right? And so we see the emergence of cannabis cultivation in the late 1960s, early 1970s. It doesn't get ramped up, however, until the 1980s. This is often referred to as kind of the first gold rush. There's not a ton of written about this period, but I have flagged this one book primarily because it grinds my gears. It's called Cash Crop: An American Dream. It comes out in the 1980s, and the kind of complaint of the author is that all of these people are now flocking into Northwestern California in the 1980s to grow weed because the DEA had artificially inflated cannabis prices, right? At times during the 1980s, an ounce of cannabis is worth more than an ounce of gold, right? So you got a lot of people coming into California to grow cannabis. And he's really mad. He's like, I hate all these green rushers. They should leave so that all of the indigenous cannabis farmers can get back to what they were doing. And no, he's not talking about Yurok people or Hoopa people or Wiyot people or Taloa people or Karuk people, right? He's talking about these back to the landers, right? Who got there a decade and a half earlier, right? And started growing weed. And so there's a lot of discourse, right? Around kind of the OG weed growers, right? At the expense of the erasure, right? Of the actual indigenous peoples of this region. Before we look at some photographs, I want to read this quote from your speaker last week, Dr. Kutcha Risling-Baldy, to kind of segue into some of the photographs I'll show in a moment. Kutcha says, "The rush mentality is what founded Humboldt County. People act like that was so long ago, and we've definitely moved on, that we're this very green-friendly place, we're liberals, we're leftist. This is how people think of Humboldt County. But what founded us is this gold rush, and we've been rushing ever since. So after the gold rush, well, gold didn't make us enough money. Let's rush any kind of minerals that we can get. And then after that, well, that didn't make us enough. Let's rush timber. And I think we've been rushing since 1849. We'll start with water. Oh, I can skip over this. Okay. So this is, and then I'll remind us again, all of the photographs that we are looking at are trespass cultivation sites. This means there is no kind of pretense about going through the regulated market, right? These are often referred to as like guerrilla grows. It is folks kind of showing up on tribal land, public land, which for me is a euphemism for stolen land, right? Setting up their shop, making their harvest, and then leaving. Cannabis is a pretty water intensive crop. What you're looking at here is a grow site has dug out a big pit. They lined it with this tarp, and then they stuck a pipe in the river, right? We've had entire tributaries of the Klamath River be dewatered, meaning there's no water in it at all, right? As a result of this. Additionally, many cultivators like don't have like a PhD in agronomy, and are probably unfamiliar, right, with agricultural best practices. One horror story that a friend shared with me, one grow site, they bought like a 40-gallon drum of some sort of like chemical, and like typically you dilute that, right? So it's like 90% water, 10% solution, right? And you pour it in your little spray bottle or whatever. They didn't know that, and they dumped a 40-gallon drum into a makeshift pond like this, right? And so that is ultimately going to seep back into the soil, right? Back into the river tributary system, right? And we know there will be contamination in that way, right? Here's another example of water storage infrastructure. You'll find it at Trespass Grow. This is a tank, right, filled with water. And I actually got to observe Operation Yurok in 2016. One of the guys on the crew used to be a plumber, and he kept telling me, Kaitlin, none of these growers are good plumbers. And I was like, cool. What does that have to do with anything? Right. But the Yurok tribe is tasked, right, with creating a water budget to demonstrate, right, how much water is being illegally siphoned out of the Klamath River, which is incredibly difficult to do when those diversions are unregulated. And so what he was informing me of is it's not only that like the tribe needs to calculate, right, how much water is in this tank at any given moment, right? They also need to account for the fact that it is leaking 24/7, right? And so kind of just another right example of how it gets really messy, right, to demonstrate these settler colonial harms, particularly when they are unregulated. Often the irrigation infrastructure at grow sites will include tiny polyethylene tubes. These run all up and down entire mountainsides, right? There's hundreds, thousands, right, out there. I tell a story in the book about ripping up these irrigation tubes, and it was really hot out, and I made this huge pile, and then I turn and look, and then there's just another hillside still completely covered in them, right? I actually opened the book by talking about these polyethylene tubes. And so in 2016, as you may know, right, the eyes of the world were on Cannonball, North Dakota, right? And Oceti-Sakowin Nation and their allies were standing up against the Dakota Access Pipeline, right? In 2006, it was October of 2016. I was a graduate student at UC Davis. Folks had organized a standing rock teach-in, and my colleague in the Native American Studies graduate program, Dr. Jessa Ray Growing Thunder, who is Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota, she got on the stage and shared the story of Zuzaka Sapa, or the Black Snake Prophecy. And I'm not as good a storyteller as Jessa, but basically the prophecy goes that one day, like a giant black snake would cut across Oceti-Sacoan territory, and it would be up to the people to rise up and defeat it, right? Pretty transparently, the Dakota Access Pipeline. And I was biking home from that teach-in, and I was like, oh shit, we have black snakes too, right? It's not like one giant one you can see from space, right? They're tiny, they're hidden. If you don't know where to look, they're invisible, right? And there's like hundreds or thousands of them out there, right? And so I start the book with this story to really situate, right, trespass cannabis cultivation in Northwestern California within this broader discourse of environmental justice, right, across Turtle Island, right? Next we'll look at some clear cutting photos. So, right, conversion of forested land to agricultural land, right, is one of the top contributors of climate change across the planet. Yurok territory is heavily forested, right? It's also incredibly mountainous. And so that means we're talking really steep slopes. We're talking kind of rocky soils as you get into higher elevations. And so for water, what this means is when you water cannabis crops in rocky soil at really high elevations, what's going to happen is it's just going to run down the mountain, right? And so when we're actually talking about estimates of how much water it takes, where that crop is planted is like a huge factor, but like, right, cannabis lobbyists always want to talk about it as if it's uniform, right? As if there's one amount of water, right, that all cannabis plants need. But due to the geography of Yurok territory, right, this actually really increases, right, the types of things cannabis needs, like gallons of water per plant, for example. Additionally, we also see a lot of clear cutting, right? Because this is a heavily forested region. And so during the war on drugs, being behind the redwood curtain was an asset, right? It helped keep you hidden. Now, ecologically speaking, does it make sense to grow massive quantities of weed in a redwood forest? Probably not, right? Here are two aerial photos of clear cuts. Here's a comparison photo to kind of give you a sense of the rapidity, right? The rush, right? Rush to do it. The top photograph is before 2012. The bottom photograph you're looking at is right after 2014. For context, Operation Yurok begins its first year, right, in 2014. I'm not a wildlife biologist. What wildlife biologists have told me is that when you have several smaller grows that are clear cuts, often growers will kind of create trail networks between them, right? So that you can walk to the other grow and do what you need to do. Whereas wildlife would typically like to stay away from these sites because loud noise, pot stinks, right? For a lot of reasons, wildlife would naturally select, right, to avoid these types of places. But what wildlife biologists tell us is when you create a trail network, critters will just follow the trail, right? And so many grow sites, right? We have found deceased more than human relatives, including bears, mountain lions, coyotes, and a lot of deer that are poached during the off season. And then a lot of smaller critters are intentionally poisoned. And so my next slide includes an image of a deceased more than human relative. I just want to let folks know that before I have the slide appear. So toxicants is a huge issue at a lot of trespass grow sites. The yellow boxes you're looking at the top left are rodenticides. These are over-the-counter rat poisons. They come in bacon flavor, right? And they're a vitamin K inhibitor. So it doesn't kill you immediately upon consumption. It cuts your ability to clot your blood, right? And so these critters will just kind of bleed out internally. But it makes them incredibly susceptible to predation, right? And so if a critter like the fisher, which is here featured here, they're probably not just gonna drop over dead. They're gonna like get really woozy and become easy prey and are most likely going to be eaten by another critter, which means, right, these contaminants are going to remain, right, in our ecosystem through processes of bioaccumulation. Right, on the top right, you're looking at a hot dog on a fish hook that has been stuffed with carbamates. I don't have my little note card to tell me what carbamates do, but don't ingest them. There's actually a wildlife ecologist named Murad Gabriel. He does work like remediation work on trespass grows in the Sierra Nevadas, and he's done a little bit of work in Hoopa, so that's why I know him. And he told me his crew wears hazmat suits. And one time they opened a container, and if anybody had like breathed it in, right, it could have caused respiratory failure. And I immediately thought to our tribal environmental program. We didn't have enough gloves, let alone hazmat suits, right? And I'm thinking about like the occupational safety hazards, right? Of like grant funded, very small, right, tribal environmental programs. And even kind of taking tabs on what contaminants are at the site in itself is challenging because all of their contaminants are not like alphabetized and neatly filed in a storage cabinet, right? We're talking about like greenhouses that are like littered with garbage and there's like a milk jug of something bright blue or like a Nestle water bottle filled with something bright pink, right? It's actually really difficult to ascertain what contaminants we're even talking about, right? Lab testing is incredibly expensive. And when we do send those contaminants to labs, what they do is they're actually just like kind of running through a sheet of like, these are all the chemicals that are legal for purchase in the United States. Right. And they're just like matching, like, is it this one? Nope, nope, nope. And often the chemicals that we find at these sites are not, I mean, they're manufactured in the US, of course, but they're not like legally they're not available for legal purchase within the US. So it's actually quite challenging to ascertain what contaminants we're even talking about, right? Which is a big issue. Lots of garbage. I don't know if anybody else watch Hoarders, but it's not that big of an exaggeration. It's lots of household garbage, but also chemicals, equipment, right? These are plastic containers filled with diesel, propane, gasoline, right? Eventually, these plastics are going to break down, right? And whatever's inside of them is going to seep into the soil, seep into the water, right? Here's a bunch of generators, right? Or batteries, right? You see a lot of like broken vehicles, abandoned like RVs, a bunch of fridges, a bunch of ovens. Just one site had like 1,200 bicycles. No idea why. But we're talking about like a really tremendous amount, right, of stuff. And so when we talk about cleaning up sites and disposing of what is there, right, these aren't just small little like, oh, let's get a volunteer crew to like go clean it up this afternoon, right? These are like multi-month, multi-year cleanup projects, right? I'm gonna end on a, let me check time. Okay, great. I'm gonna end on a gross story. So to be fair, I warned you. Um, Trespass cultivators aren't interested, right, in investing in the area and staying there forever, right? After their harvest, they're out of there. So often, they will not construct the infrastructure you need if you have a sizable workforce that is staying in a particular locale for an extended period of time. Meaning, most trespass grows aren't constructing latrines. Some of you might know where this story is going. In 2015, we were getting a bunch of reports that Yurok tribal members were getting sick with E. coli. The tribe did its due diligence. It went to all the RV parks, even though they were all downriver of them anyway, right? And like went down the list and was like, well, can't be that, can't be that, can't be that. And there was nothing upriver of where people were getting sick. And the tribe deduced that the people were getting sick from the contamination from trespass cultivation sites. There were some grow sites that were openly defecating, right, in the tributaries of the Klamath River. And one grow site, and thank God I was not on this site visit, they found 100 5-gallon buckets filled and capped with human sewage. And so my question is this: why does it fall on the Yurok tribe to clean up settler shit? Literally, right? The Sierra Fund did a report in 2008. In that report, they said there are still 50,000 mines that are left over from the gold rush. 87% of them present either human or environmental health impacts, right? And so if the state of California has not yet figured out how to clean up after the gold rush, like what makes it think it is equipped, right, to deal with the ramifications of the green rush, right? Thank you so much for having me. I'm going to end it there. And if there's any questions or comments, happy to field those. Thanks for coming, everybody.
Yay, thank you so much, Dr. Reed, for that. That was super fascinating and super relevant nowadays. But I'll open it up for questions and comments from the audience. So if you have any, feel free to put it in the chat and we'll say it out. But if feel free to also unmute yourself if you have one. I'll go ahead. And I
Yeah,
guess,
great question.
oh, so yeah, I guess if there hasn't been one, I guess one question that we might have is like, what are some key ways that settlers um or not settlers, but like Asian American immigrant community, how can we resist settler colonialism either through activism or through their everyday lives?
Yeah. I don't know if I have a good answer for that question, but what came to mind for me is kind of the intersecting histories. One book I'll recommend for folks. Um, oh, let me pull up my online bibliography thing. It's a new text. It came out maybe 2 years ago now. It like had just come out when I was writing. Let's see here. I'm throwing a citation in the chat, and I just found this book super fascinating. Hold on. It doesn't want to paste for me. Here we go. And so when I was doing kind of the chapter 1 on the gold rush, May Nai's work was really the reason I read that book is because there's like an opening story about some Chinese migrant communities in Southern Oregon working with local tribes in Oregon to kind of create this like memorial regarding like people who had kind of passed during the gold rush. And of course, right, I focused on California in today's lecture, but Oregon is also experiencing right similar attacks against indigenous peoples. And those kind of intersecting histories of violence, right? I think May Nai does like a really great job of talking about and kind of so indigenous peoples, right, are also exploited for labor, right, during this time. And kind of there's moments of tension, but there's also these moments of solidarity. And so I would, if folks want a gold rush history, because after my talk and Katja's talk, folks might have the gold rush on their brain. This I think is a really great history that's kind of weaving together Chinese migrants narratives alongside indigenous Californians, which sometimes are beneficial, sometimes kind of conflicting. But I think it's kind of really complex and nuanced. More contemporary. I think being in conversation, right, with indigenous scholars and kind of, right, I think we talk about citation politics a lot, right? But like one thing I always like go around into different spaces and I'm always like, are there any indigenous folks on your curriculum? Right? So I think like that is a way, right, to be able to engage and kind of cross those boundaries. I'll also recommend the California Indian Studies and Scholars Association. They have their second annual, so we're a pretty new organization. It's a group of people who are scholars and identify as California Indian peoples across the state. We're having our second symposium in May. I believe it's May 17th through 18th. There's an option to join virtually. I think that's kind of a great way to think about, right, like what are the local California Indian communities wherever my institution is, like what's going on there, right, and what ways we can be of support. And then I guess I'll end on, I think we're at a really, really kind of significant time in terms of land return. And we need a lot of allies in that dialogue and in that discourse. In 2019 was the return of Tuluwat to the Wiyot peoples. This is the first example of a municipality returning land to a tribal nation with no strings attached. I think it is time we really put the heat on our institutions of higher education, right? A lot of us in the UCs, right? We're at land grant institutions. If you don't know about the Moral Act, right, go give yourself a bit of a history lesson, right? How did your universe? I'm operating under the assumption that lots of us in this room are like faculty, staff, or students, and like are involved in some institution of higher education. How did your university get its land? Whose land is it? Right. And what's going on your campus right now? Right. And like what ways can you get involved and support the work of kind of local the local communities, right, where your university is, right? Because when we say like how do we right develop our relationships with indigenous communities, it's like a huge category, right? We're talking over 550 nations across the US. And so I think it's really important to kind of think local, right? What immediate communities are in our area? What's going on with them, right? And what are kind of ways that we can stand up and support, right? So that'd be yeah, I'm sure that's can build you a to-do list there.
Thank you for that, Dr. Reed. I
Yeah.
know past the hour, but Jamie had an interesting question. Are there any indigenous cannabis grows that are in right relation with the land? And I guess we can finish it with that question.
Totally. So, in the state of California, tribes are systematically locked out of participating in California's cannabis economy. And so, on the one hand, you have like ground zero, which is my territory, where we are dealing with entire rivers going dry due to trespass cultivation. Simultaneously, you have tribes that want to pursue cannabis cultivation as a site of economic development, right? And are systematically locked out of doing that. And so in California's cannabis legislation, there is no references to tribes whatsoever. There is an organization, they are called CNACA, California Native American Cannabis Association. They proposed Assembly Bill 924 in 2019. It would similarly be kind of structured similarly to gaming, wherein each tribe would have a compact with the governor. It would be subjected to legislative approval, and then that tribe could participate in the state cannabis economy. The state Senate came back and said, you will need to waive sovereign immunity. Tribe said non-starter, and the bill died in the Senate later that year. So there's only one tribe in the entirety of California that is able to operate a dispensary. It's the Santa Ynez Chumash. And so everything needs to happen within reservation boundaries because many of our tribes are quite remote, right? They're removed from like large populations. And so like ideally, right, that tribe would be able to have a dispensary in San Diego or Los Angeles where their retail would do much better. Because of the current structuring of their law, everything from start to finish has to operate within reservation boundaries. My thought is tribes are sovereign nations, and it is not my place to tell a sovereign nation what they should or should not do. And to me, that's like opening the barn door, right? If we start to say, hey, tribes, you can't do that, right? It's not too much of a reach to be like, and also you can't do that, and you can't do that, and you can't do that. And so my kind of priority is that we do not infringe, right, upon tribal sovereignty. That being said, if you are in Southern California, you get your water through the Central Valley Water Project, which diverts from the Trinity River, which is a tributary of the Klamath River, right? So that might be right where I'd want to have an engaged discussion, and I might have issues. But in terms of like, should tribes be able to cultivate cannabis? Yes, they're sovereign nations. They should be able to do that, right? If when we're talking about water use, right, I might have some things I want to talk about, right? But there into your question, Jamie, there is one tribal dispensary. It operates within reservation boundaries, and that is because tribes are systematically locked out of the rest of the market.
Well, thank you, Dr. Reed, again for taking the time to speak with us today. I hope we get to connect soon later in the future. And with everyone else, I hope to see you all in our next talk. All right.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for inviting me. And the speaker series is really important. So thanks for hosting.
Thank you.
Everybody.